Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue this morning's technical program with the President's Plenary, and it's my pleasure to introduce our four distinguished members of today's panel: Bill Berry, Julie Robinson, Mary Beth Eden, and Michael Picot. Dr. Bill Berry is an independent historian. He retired from NASA in the summer of 2020 after serving as chief historian for a decade. Bill began his career at NASA in 2001, working in the International Relations Office at headquarters. Later, he served as the NASA European representative at the U.S. Embassy in Paris before being selected as chief historian. A graduate with honors of the United States Air Force Academy in '79, Bill served in the Air Force for 22 years as a pilot and professor at the Academy. He also holds a master's degree from Stanford University and a doctorate from Oxford University. Our second panelist is Dr. Julie Robinson. She's the chief scientist for the ISS for NASA and has an interdisciplinary background in the physical and biological sciences. Her professional experience has included research activities in a variety of fields, including virology, analytical chemistry, genetics, statistics, field biology, and remote sensing. She's authored numerous scientific publications before moving to science management. She earns a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Utah State in '89, and has earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology from the University of Nevada, Reno. Our third panelist is Mary Beth Eden. She is the manager of the Research Integration Office within the ISS program, responsible for enabling all research and technical development on the ISS. This includes research sponsored by NASA and other government agencies, as well as commercial and nonprofit use, which takes advantage of the ISS being a national laboratory. After joining NASA in '89, she worked on advanced life support system development and ISS environmental control and life support systems. Ms. Eden holds a BS in in chemical engineering from the University of Texas and a master's in chemical engineering from Rice. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Michael Picot. He's currently a professor in the Division of Biomedical Engineering Sciences within the Department of Basic Sciences at Loma Linda University. Over the course of his research career, Dr. Picot has evaluated the impact of various components of the spaceflight environment on immune function. As a graduate student within the Department of Aerospace Engineering Science at University of Colorado Boulder, he focused primarily on gravitational load and physiological and psychological stress components of this environment. Later, as a postdoc and independent investigator within the Department of Radiation Medicine at Loma Linda, his focus broadened to include the low dose rate radiation inherent to solar particle events and galactic cosmic rays. So our first panelist that's going to be talking is Bill Berry. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks for the introduction. So my job here is to give a quick historical overview of the ISS while trying not to wander too far over the topics that will be covered by other people on the panel too many times. But let me start with something that you may see a lot of these days, and that's, of course, a picture of the inside of the ISS. This one was taken just a couple of weeks ago on October 27th, and the focus here is on Kate Rubins and the fact that she voted from space. And isn't that a great thing that voting from space has become normal? But to me, this picture says a lot more, and I'll point to just one of the things that come to me when I look at this picture. And I would say first look at the embroidery on Kate's jacket. It says Expedition 64 if you can't read it. 20 years ago, when Expedition 1 launched, I could imagine many crews into the future, but shortly after that, I began to worry if we'd even get the 10 crews. Yet, since November 2000, over 240 people have lived and worked on the ISS. And for someone who grew up during the race to the moon, that's still a bit mind-boggling to have accumulated that sort of experience in one spacecraft. So from where I sit, I'd say that the story of the ISS is one that's full of unexpected twists and turns, but also one of surprising resilience. It may not have turned out as we expected, but it isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of achieving capabilities in sometimes unexpected ways. And as your local historian, let me recap all that story by looking back and way back to 1869. The dreams and aspirations for humans living in space go a long way back, but the idea of humans living in a vehicle that we crafted ourselves in orbit around the Earth, well, the realistic discussion of that probably dates back to the later half of the second half of the 19th century. This particular picture is a drawing of the brick moon being constructed, and it's based on a story by the author Edward Everett Hale that ran in the Atlantic Monthly magazine in 1869. Over the next century, though, a lot of serious scientific thought was applied to this idea. And we reached this point in the early 1950s when artist Chesley Bonestell was crafting depictions of space stations like the one we see here in this picture. And at the dawn of the space age, most serious thinkers about space expected that humanity would follow sort of a logical path of first learn to fly in Earth orbit, then build a space station, and then the key to sustainability there would be to build an efficient transportation system for getting crews and equipment to those stations. And then only after all that experience and infrastructure was in place, would we use these space stations as a jumping off point for human expedition to the moon and other planets. But this guy changed all that. On May 25th, 1961, President Kennedy set the US and the Soviet Union eventually on a race to the moon. President Kennedy upended the paradigm, and space stations and the vehicles to sustain them, those didn't come back on the political decision-making agenda again until the year that Kennedy's goal of human expedition to the moon was finally achieved. That year, 1969, another new president, Richard Nixon, thought it was time to re-examine US plans for the future of space exploration. So he commissioned his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to lead the Space Task Group to come up with some new objectives for the post-Apollo era. And the cover of their report is shown here in this picture. In addition to long-range plans to build bases on the moon and send humans to Mars, hopefully before the end of the 20th century, the Space Task Group fell back on the old paradigm. The recommendations included building an Earth orbital space station. This was one of the several designs proposed. But to maximize the efficiency, you wouldn't just use Apollo-era capsules to get to it, like shown in this illustration. Instead, the Space Task Group called for building a vehicle that would regularly carry people from the surface of the Earth to the station, a shuttle vehicle. And this is one of the designs that was of a shuttle that was envisioned by the Space Task Group in 1969. Now, unfortunately, Vice President Agnew and the rest of the Space Task Group, they were completely out of touch with what President Nixon had in mind. Nixon had wanted to make NASA a normal government agency, not a top priority program aimed at putting humanity on the other planets in the rest of the century. Nixon had other priorities besides space exploration. So that Space Task Group recommendations, they went over like a lead balloon. And after this, President Nixon simply avoided making any decisions about space priorities until after Apollo, until they absolutely had to. And absolutely had to came about 2.5 years later. With his re-election campaign underway and with heavy losses in aerospace jobs piling up as the Apollo program wound down, he had to do something. So throwing out almost all of the Space Task Group report, Nixon approved construction of just one part of it. So he directed NASA to build the space shuttle. But he said no to the idea of building a space station that it was planned to shuttle to. This decision was great for Nixon because it allowed him to avoid being blamed for killing the US human spaceflight program. And it improved his election prospects in California by keeping the space industry there alive. But it also left NASA with the job of building one of those bridges to nowhere, a shuttle without a space station to get shuttled to. And I suspect that that explains at least the part why NASA Administrator Jim Fletcher, who's on the left here in this picture, has that look on his face. But a dozen years later and 3 presidents later, With the space shuttle finally operational, NASA did finally get approval to build the space station. With the State of the Union speech commitment made in 1984, President Nixon began the space station program with high hopes that it would unite the Western world in an ambitious project. And as with the space shuttle, the rhetoric and expectations were high, but the funding never matched the rhetoric. The size and capabilities of what was shown here in this early slide as the visible symbol of US strength were continually downscoped over the next few years. Nonetheless, by 1988, international agreements were signed with Europe and Canada and Japan to build Space Station Freedom, as it became known, with a focus largely on the first thing on this list, microgravity research. 4 years later, this is a chart from the Space Station Freedom Strategic Plan from 1992. Plans were still sliding to the right. First element launch, the FEL shown in this chart in the upper left, was now not expected until late 1995 at the earliest. And the ability to support a permanent crew of 4 would be no earlier than the fourth quarter of 1999. That's the PMC on this chart. Now, as you may recall, 1992 was another presidential election year. And the next year, early in the next year, the Clinton administration arrived on the scene, and it turned 1993 into a pivotal year for the Space Station Freedom Program. This was the year when the project famously survived a vote in Congress to kill it in June 1993 by just one vote. I'll note that that decisive vote was cast by the late, great Representative John Lewis, by the way. But 1993 was also the year when Russia was formally invited to join the project, and Space Station Freedom was recast with some new objectives and known as the International Space Station. This, of course, required yet another major redesign and renegotiation of the international agreements. This graphic here shows the planned components of the ISS when the Intergovernmental Agreement was signed in early 1998. This is a graphic that came out with the documents. One thing not called out on this diagram is that the ISS was planned to have a crew of 7 at the time, with 3 allocated to the Russian segment and 4 planned for the US orbital segment. And also not shown in this diagram is the space shuttle, which was of course the key to building and then operating the US segment. But the role of the space shuttle becomes much more obvious when you look at the flight schedule for building that space station. This is a pretty aggressive plan to put the first permanent crew up in late 2000 in a partially assembled station. That's the first Soyuz vehicle on the top row there. Also note, if you can see it on the bottom right corner, down in the bottom of the 2002 column, that was this dotted red line that was supposed to show assembly complete. So 4 years planned from the first launch to shifting to science operations on the International Space Station. Now, as we all have been reminded this week, Expedition 1 arrived at the ISS on November 1st, 2000, to a station with lots of construction work still left to do and very limited time for research. But 6 days later, it was another election year, and George W. Bush was elected president of the United States. And once again, the new administration, when it showed up in January, was not particularly happy with what they found out about the space station program. So just after taking office in early 2001, the Bush administration unilaterally announced that the station would be truncated to a core complete configuration in an effort to contain budget overruns. This began more replanning and a long series of difficult negotiations with the partnership that would actually wind up running for most of the Bush administration. Adding to the difficulties for the partnership was the Iran Non-Proliferation Act. Passed by the Congress in 2000, this banned US payments to Russia in connection with the ISS, unless the president determined that Russia was taking steps to halt proliferation of nuclear weapons and missile technology to Iran. And then this act in 2005 was later expanded to cover Korea and North Korea and Syria. So this added major complications to the partnership in working out plans for the future. But the biggest blow, of course, came in the early years of operations for the space station came in February 2003 when the crew of STS-107 was killed on reentry. Now, there were some in the Bush administration who pushed for grounding the shuttle program entirely and effectively killing the ISS program at this point. But instead, and I'd say surprisingly, the accident actually led to a sweeping re-examination of the US human spaceflight program and the announcement just a year later after the accident that the Bush administration was doubling down on space with the vision for space exploration. While this program was focused on sending humans to the moon and onto Mars, it did allow for the completion of the ISS, but it also called for the end of the shuttle program once ISS assembly was complete. Ironically, we would finally get the space station, but not have the shuttle that had been the basis for all the plans for operations. And by the time we were done, the ISS would no longer have a centrifuge module, a habitation module, a US crew return vehicle, and a number of other things. But the crew return vehicle is a critical one because relying on Soyuz as the lifeboat like this meant that the US segment crew would permanently drop from 4 people to 3 people, greatly reducing research time available. But the space station program did make it through this tough first decade. The crew was reduced from 3 to 2, from Expedition 7 through 13, and there were some close calls on our ability to keep that crew on board. And we also dealt with some other unexpected issues in that first decade, like the advent of space flight participants, paying visitors to the space station. But the shuttle did return to flight, and construction work was completed just a little bit beyond the announced schedule. And this picture of Shuttle Endeavour on its last mission, STS-134 in May of 2011, is to me a bittersweet reminder of what we expected the ISS would look like for years to come. But instead, the shuttles would all be grounded in the summer of 2011, and we'd be, once again, living with only half of the space infrastructure that we had expected. And at this point, the prospect of a US spacecraft to transport crew to and from the ISS was continuing to slide to the right. This may all seem like a long tale of woe to those who slog through it, but I would argue that the reality was actually much more hopeful than it might appear. While the first decade of ISS operations may have seemed pretty tenuous, it was a time when, for the most part, the ISS partnership rose to the challenges to keep the space station program going, despite some heavy obstacles. It was also a time when creative new approaches flourished, as they had to. For example, the vision for space exploration had called for NASA to develop a commercialization plan to support future operations. When Mike Griffin came in as NASA administrator in 2005, he applied that mandate to the ISS. And because Griffin had experience working in partnership with his industry to spur innovation in his jobs in other parts of the government. And with many people suggesting that NASA was old and creaky and should just get out of the way and let others get the job done, NASA turned around and said, in effect, okay, prove it that you can do this. So the commercial cargo program was created to create a path and incentives and seed money to build real capabilities. And much to the surprise of many people, it actually worked. The SpaceX flew their first mission to the ISS, shown in this picture here, in 2012. And then Orbital Sciences demonstrated their Cygnus cargo spacecraft the next year. These commercial vehicles dramatically eased the cargo supply problem. And the commercial cargo program, of course, eventually paved the way for a commercial crew program, which solved the other problem created by the end of the space shuttle program. And as we all know, SpaceX conducted the very first Crew Dragon test flight this summer. That's the Crew Dragon vehicle hanging off the Harmony module to the right there, partially hidden behind ESA's Columbus module in the center. SpaceX Crew Mission 1 is scheduled to launch next Saturday, November 14th, and it'll bring a crew of 4 to the ISS and will, at long last, have a crew of 7 on the ISS. Hopefully, Boeing will succeed with its upcoming Starliner flights and will have as robust a system for crew transportation as we do for cargo. So despite all the unexpected changes and shifts of fortune over the last 2 decades, the ISS program has shown incredible resilience. Given all the challenges, I think it's remarkable that the program has responded so creatively and effectively to a number of potentially deadly blows. Often it seems associated with elections, and still kept on track toward achieving many of the capabilities that were originally envisioned, and some we didn't expect. We have a pretty robust cargo supply system, and with the advent of new crew vehicles, we should be able to keep the US crew segment size at 4, regaining the research time that we lost at the very beginning of crew operations. Now, I'm a historian. I'm not in the business of predicting the future, but it is clear that we're on the brink, to me anyway, of a new era in operations of the ISS. What will this future hold? Will it be long and productive, or will it be cut short by a rush to the moon or some other post-election redirection? How would I plan my research agenda if I were you? Well, I'm not you, so I don't really know, but the historical record suggests to me that this hard-won capability that we have in space has proven remarkably resilient in the face of any number of threats. So while I'd be inclined to expect surprises, I might also be planning for the long run. Thanks for your attention, and we'll take questions when we get to the end of the presentation. So back to you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Dr. Julie Robinson.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to have the opportunity to speak with you today. And it's a really interesting time to be asked to speak on this topic because I'm in a transition between the career that I've spent as ISS Chief Scientist in a new role in human exploration and operations that includes all human spaceflight. So it does include ISS and commercial low Earth orbit, but also the new Artemis endeavors and our plan to go both back to the moon and then onto Mars. So it was a great time to kind of think back about what the last 20 years has looked like. And I took the opportunity to sort of share a then and now kind of a perspective of some things that from my early time in ISS and things that just stuck out to me as highlights. Oftentimes people would ask me over the last 20 years, what's your favorite ISS experiment? And I would just kind of tell them that's like asking someone who their favorite child is. It's not a fair question because there's so many different things. But I did let myself kind of say what moments stood out to me, not maybe because of their historic significance, but because of how they built to the overall whole in the place that we're at today. So I want to start by reminding you all what mission control looked like back when I first became involved in ISS. One of the things you'll notice here are the ties. Another thing you might notice is the genders. This is people watching the mating of Zarya to on ISS at that assembly point with Unity. And the main woman in it is actually the astronaut that's putting things together up there. And this was a NASA culture. In the ISS program at that point in time, there was one woman in the staff meeting at the table, and science had assigned places that were not at the table because assembly was the important task. So the chief scientist and then as I began supporting them in about 2004, had to sit on the side so that they wouldn't, be in the way of the most important business going on at the time. This is what mission control started looking like in 2010 when we had a suite of women leaders controlling that. If you looked in ISS today, I don't have a picture of the conference room, but you'll notice it's more than 50% women leaders that are running the table and managing the ISS program across all kinds of different roles as engineers. And you'll note that science sits at the table and has a voice in everything going on at the highest levels in the ISS program. Another thing that I think about is the things that are not the way we expected. We thought that the shuttle would be the workhorse and would be flying racks back and forth to the space station, and that would be how we would do our science, giant refrigerators, other kinds of facilities. Instead, we're working with a set of commercial vehicles that are operating in ways that we never imagined. We actually have better capabilities in many times than what were originally envisioned, but the way we do science is fundamentally different. The racks have been this amazing workhorse with interoperability standards and things that we're now trying to make sure we take those lessons learned and apply them in Artemis. Those racks have been a standard for over 17 years, which is amazing in the life of spaceflight hardware. But I think what nobody would have ever anticipated is that mil-spec 1553 data would be completely overcome by events, that Ethernet, that USB connections, that we would have students building cube labs in schools and flying them, getting through a certification process and flying them, that we'd have CubeSats generated from around the space station. All of that is a technology and a miniaturization that has enabled science but was far beyond what we could have imagined when the RAC standards were first written. The first experiment on the space station was a protein crystal growth experiment. It launched before the crew launched, and was an enhanced nitrogen dewar that then sat there, let the crystallization happen. And one of the, that I think that's a sign of both the promise and the frustrations that happened early as science struggled for funding, as resource capabilities were unpredictable. In this case, this particular experiment got dropped on the tarmac when it was returned on the space shuttle, and the crystals that formed were damaged, and that limited some of its return. And so there was a lot of heartbreak on certain experiments, and that's one reason why this one stands out in my mind. Interestingly, though, instead of focusing on proving that you could grow bigger crystals in all situations in space, which is how protein crystal growth started, now we see these kind of targeted commercial activities like this one by Merck, looking at how could you crystallize and do better purifications of Keytruda. So very targeted, focused commercial applications. And that area of research, perhaps not in the more broad fundamental way, but in much more applied ways, continues to this day on board the ISS. This is, of course, what the first crew looked like. And I pulled this point up as sort of the beginning of crew activities. In my own world, this was when I made my transition to start really actively supporting not just Earth sciences on the ISS, but all of the work on the ISS. And this paper, which is not in a really super important journal, it's in EOS, which is the Transactions of the AGU, but it is a paper I wanted to call out because the crew members were tracking and taking pictures of airports, as pilots are often like to do. And we used this, did photogrammetry on it, and proved that the crew members could take photographs with 8-meter spatial resolution, which was thought to be impossible because they could just physically function like a little barn door tracker and track things. This turned out to be the first peer-reviewed publication from the International Space Station. It was mine and Cindy Evans, and that made people really unhappy because it was supposed to be a life or physical sciences breakthrough that came, and there was all kinds of discussion about whether or not this was really science. And it was fateful for me because it's what got me drawn in to come to ISS for 1 year, step away from my research, and learn how programmatic management worked. And I thought that would be kind of an interesting way to gain some perspective in my career. And it turns out I never came back. I never came back to my own research after that point. And that work, even though it was such a small paper, it enabled a series of future things. Now, it took us until 2011 to have the first Nature paper from the ISS. People were looking for that from the very beginning because it was supposed to be a breakthrough platform. That was also in the Earth and Space Sciences, in this case, a relativistic jet activity from a black hole swallowing a star, which was captured first from the MAXI monitoring all-sky X-ray imager about 2 hours before the NASA dedicated satellite got in position to see that event. So that was our first Nature paper. That was a huge accomplishment that stands out in my mind. And then, of course, the suite of instruments, as we finally, after assembly complete, brought the Science Mission Directorate on board, and they took advantage of these great platforms that had been built so they could take advantage of the position in low Earth orbit. That also really stands out in my mind as a long-term accomplishment. The growing of plants, starting with NASA-Russian collaboration in 2002 itself in the Lada greenhouse, was really important standout. Today, we see that in the advanced plant habitat with some of the most sophisticated plant monitoring capabilities we've had in space. In space is another example that stands out for me because in this case, Peggy made an operator error that led to a whole new suite of experiment measurements that we didn't imagine, and eventually understanding of colloidal self-assembly in materials, new insights that came from that microgravity environment. These kinds of eureka moments with crew members involved in them and making those observations is much of what I think the ISS offered to scientists. And this was one of the first examples of that being achieved in a way that an automated experiment could never have done. And the same has occurred in other physical sciences, from capillary flow and cool flames are two that jump out into my mind. Rodent research has been one of our greatest challenges. It was something that was much desired by the community. It was taken out during the ISS assembly challenges. And then it was something we were able to finally bring back in. Bringing rodent research in was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And what's been interesting about it is how it's opened up so many more questions than answers. As a model organism, as we look at behavior changes, different species, different strains, different ages of mice, different kinds of behavior. The fact that we can open the cages means that we can be asked by our IACUCs to do things a variety of ways. We have a lot of great experiments. I'm really proud of things like Chia Su's NEL1 experiment that came in through the National Lab, other kinds of great activity going on. But in some ways, I think we have more questions about rodents in space than we have answers. I feel like we understand the crew a little better than we understand the mice and their reaction to being in space. The one-year mission stands out to me as well. In this case, the one-year mission had to happen for some political reasons and some launch and return reasons. And when we announced and first sat down with Scott Kelly, I was sitting there with John Charles, who's the chief scientist from the Human Research Program. John was not happy about a one-year mission. That was not in his original research plan. And we were telling Scott what likely kinds of science would look like. And he said, well, you know, I'm a twin. Can't you do something with that? And John said, well, we're not allowed. And I said, well, do you think you could ask? Since he asked, why don't we answer the question? That led through a number of different discussions to the twin study, which has opened up the ability for NASA to have an interim policy, start looking at genetic data as appropriate in the crew, and even now led to Human Research Program's plans for the CIPHER study, really getting a set of one-year crew members and using time as an independent variable for an experimental study of crew health and performance. So those things lead us today where we're thinking about ISS as a deep space analog for transit. We could change things. We could make things more complex. Durations, isolation and confinement, simulate autonomy and communications delay, medical simulations, and so forth. And we're starting to think about ISS as a piece of our Moon to Mars strategy. We also think about things we can do on the lunar surface. And then how do we make sure all of those pieces of information, all of that crew operational experience and crew health and medical care prepare us to go to Mars? And so as we look forward in ISS, we're going to be able to take advantage of the first days of return from ISS and use that as an analog to the first days of living on Mars after a landing. That's a really critical time window, something we can do from ISS that we have not done yet. Looking at autonomy and crew medical care, possibility of doing medical event simulations like one we did back in April is important. Looking at communications delay and how do we change to store and forward versus continuous conversation on space to ground is something that would make ISS look more like it did in Expedition 1 and less like it does today, but could give us really important observations. And that connects to our human spaceflight strategy that we're developing for Artemis, where early mission operations are analog for the first Mars landing as we extend duration in infrastructure and we get to a point of combination missions. So it's not Moon or ISS. It's really an integrated human spaceflight strategy where we learn everything we can from the ISS, and then we learn what we need to learn on the Moon as well in preparation for going to Mars. I see that as a continuous and seamless connection between the many different disciplines that I've had the opportunity and honor to help shepherd through complex human spaceflight. I couldn't tell you the thousands of stories that I have in my mind, the opportunities I've had to help you guys get your work done. Many times you didn't even know. And the dedicated people on the human spaceflight side that try to make these things happen when spaceflight is so hard. It's been an amazing 20 years for ISS, but there's another decade to come. Thanks.
Thank you. Julie, it's really hard to pick your favorite child. So thank you for your efforts and your presentation there. I'd like to turn to Mary Beth.
All right, good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to talk about a little bit different part of the journey of ISS over 20 years. You know, Bill talked about the history and kind of how we got here and some of the political decisions and changes, and Julie did an amazing job talking through the different science highlights. I'm going to talk a little bit about more of the people and the culture and the journey we've been on as a program. If I can get the slide to advance, there we go. So this is the journey from, you know, the beginning of Build It and They Will Come to, oh my, they're here. And how as a research office, we have had to transform ourselves from rocket scientists and engineers into client support teams to really try and help execute science and get the most out of the platform for all of the researchers. You heard the history from Bill about the assembly. What I wanted to focus on for just a minute, the vision of the program during assembly is here of a human outpost in space, bringing nations together for the benefit of life on Earth and beyond. And it makes reference to science and making revolutionary discoveries, but also establishing permanent international presence of humans in space and the exploration of the solar system and enabling commerce. I want to draw your attention just for a minute to the core values of safety, commitment, integrity, trust, respect for people, and technical excellence, because I'll come back to these in just a minute. So for the first decade, these are the sort of step-by-step of how we got there. And then in July of 2011, you know, we declared assembly complete. And then a few months later, in December, the space station program manager at the time, Mr. Mike Sefferdini, decided we needed to reorganize and that now research needed to be everyone's job. And so you see the little explosion in the payloads office, because previous to this, the payloads office was its own self-contained world, and it did all of the integration for payloads, it did the verification, the safety, the operations, everything was handled completely independently in its own little sort of mini program within the program. And in 2011, what was done was to move all of the verification to the same office that does verification for the systems in the vehicle office, and put the software in the software office, and the operations, you know, link the operations office for the systems much more closely with the payload operations office in Huntsville. And so there were huge changes in how the program was structurally organized, including creating a deputy manager for utilization and moving the chief scientist, the program scientist, into the top box with the program manager. And the payloads office turned into the research integration office with a focus on integrating across the program to be able to ensure research got done. And all the enabling functions, the things that had to be done day in and day out, got moved to the offices who did that function for, whether it was for a life support system or an avionics system or a payload, the same people now did that work for everything. And so these were structural changes. And you see, we created a new vision and mission, now to be a world-renowned laboratory in space, enabling discoveries in science and technology that benefit life on Earth and exploration of the universe. So now a very science and exploration and discovery-focused vision. Similarly, the mission was modified, but the core values were essentially left the same. So then in 2013, there was what they called the Standing Review Board. This is just a process or a review board that happens with all major programs. And there was feedback from the Standing Review Board to shorten the payload integration timeline. There was also a big meeting in 2014 with the National Lab Organization and the research team to look at ideas and concerns from the payload community, and many of you were at that meeting. As I recall, it was held in Boulder at BioServe's facility. And then in July and August, we had some other meetings and training classes and things, and realized that our immediate mandate, that our program was not appropriately focused, that we had done the structural changes but not the cultural changes. And so the RISE effort was initiated, and RISE stands for Revolutionize ISS for Science and Exploration. And our goals were to really steward discovery, you see here, foster commerce in space, foster the international collaboration, and inspire the world. But what's key is our universal values were changing. Our goal was to be communicative, to be customer facing. You still have safety and technical competence, but that customer facing value was a new thing. And the challenge of turning rocket scientists and people who, you know, did that summer job at the movie theater schlepping popcorn and soft drinks and said, you know, I'm really not interested in doing that for a career. I want to go be an engineer and not have to ever do customer service again. And telling them that now your job is customer service has been a fascinating journey of its own. Our goal here was to change our values. Our top issues were not being customer focused. We're using the same processes for everything, inefficiencies, outdated requirements, tools and data systems, you know, harkening back to the shuttle days. And so our new goal was to be customer focused, and to tailor things specific to the payload, and whether it was safety or requirements or operations. And so that's what we spent a number of years doing. And many of you, I'll say, suffered through this change with us. Many of you ended up as voluntary pathfinders to try some of our new processes and provided feedback in how they were or weren't working. And then over the years, I don't know why this, there we go. We have really modified and improved our capabilities, whether it was the cargo vehicles that were mentioned, you know, where we tripled the number of powered lockers and have since then doubled them again, increased the power available for our external payloads, done what we call Extend the Lab, which many of you will look at and go, that's a shuttle sortie mission where you stayed on the shuttle the whole time. But that was a capability that we lost when we lost shuttle. So we recreated that in these cargo vehicles. Providing data for your trip to orbit is now something that we have available. We have created and finally gotten to the station to the point of being a real on-orbit lab where you can do iterative science and in situ sample analysis with the kinds of equipment you would find in a typical lab on the ground. We've upgraded infrastructure, we doubled the data rates and doubled them again. We increased the video channels, we've increased the space-to-ground communications capability, added more racks and glove boxes, external wireless systems. And then really the big change was crew time. When we got through with assembly, we were given a mandate that we would absolutely spend 35 hours a week on utilization for 3 crew, and that would come off the top. And then as we are going to 4 crew, that doubles again to nearly 70 hours a week. We have enabled tons and tons of PIs and PDs to talk with the crew on space to ground. We have done things recently, moving payloads. You know, it used to be if you were a payload and we lost power, you lost power with the rest of the vehicle. Payloads were never critical enough to be taken care of during the power losses. That's changed. Now critical payloads are on what we call the load shed table, and you will not have power dropped just because you're a payload. And that wasn't the thinking in the early days. We've also relaxed our limitations to create additional flexibility for power, for being able to jettison for how much cooling. And then with crew time, and I don't know if the charts have disappeared, but I've lost them. But the crew time has, okay, the crew time has doubled and then doubled again. You see in the crew time chart. So as we, go to 4 crew permanently, we expect this to continue to increase at that higher slope that you see just at the very end there, right before 2020. On the next chart, what we've done with processes and tools, we've reworked our entire process to work at the pace of the payload developer, as fast or as slow as the PD desires. We've put in place concierge services to support new payload developers in a number of areas. And we are now doing a much better job integrating across the program so that you don't have to. We've improved our tools. We've scrubbed our payload requirements. Over 40% of the requirements were removed. We've consolidated requirements into one document. So whether you have requirements for the SpaceX cargo vehicle or on orbit in an express rack, all of the requirements for everything you might run into are all in the same document, and there's a lovely tool that you can walk through to help you decide what's applicable and what's not, and a person who does that with you. We also put all the verification in that same tool, so SpaceX comes to get your data out of that instead of asking you directly. On the next chart, chart 11, we instituted customer service training for every person in the office and almost every person in the program. We have really harped on focus on understanding the goals of the research. What are you trying to accomplish? What is the science you're trying to do? What the business considerations are. And this isn't just a commercial thing. This is also about, when does your grant run out? What are the costs? When do your students graduate? How quickly does your research need to be done to meet the needs that you have? And what are the strategic plans of the sponsors? How does this fit in with the overall program of the Science Mission Directorate or BPS or National Lab? We worked with the UH College of Hospitality faculty to revamp our client satisfaction survey. We said, if these people are in the business of customer and client service, then maybe we should get their help. And then we shifted our overall approach to research by asking, what does it take to do this instead of focusing on the barriers to implement? One example I like to use of this is there was a payload called Solar that was looking at the sun, and they came in and they said, we'd like to do a whole solar cycle, but during this part of the month, we end up pointed away from the sun. Could you guys turn the space station to be able to allow us to have the sun view the entire month? And we said, wow, let's go chat about it. And in the end, we did it not once, but twice. So they could get 2 full solar cycles, and they could, we flew out of our normal configuration and used propellant and whatever so that we could get the full solar cycle and they could get that data. On the next chart, about how we've succeeded. So these are just the metrics that we show, but I think it's important to kind of look at these and go, we have officially just under 3,000 investigations. We do a post increment reconciliation, and so that's the last approved number. But we currently are estimating we're at 3,185 investigations, over 4,000 investigators in 108 countries, and more than 2,000 scientific results published in peer-reviewed journals to date. So Julie talked about those first publications and the first one in Nature, and all told now Station has had over 2,000 investigation or publications. You can see in the graph the differences in investigators and investigations and some of the kind of key impacts or key events that either positively or negatively impacted our ability to continue to do research over this 20-year time period. On the last chart, I'll just talk about current issues. I call this game we play constrained resource pinball. We generally run into a problem with one of our limiting resources, whether it's powered lockers, how much cold stowage we have, how many big bags. Think about filling up the trunk of your car. You can only get so many large suitcases in, and then you have to start packing the smaller ones. We have these same kind of problems, and generally solving one of them causes a problem in another one. And so some days it feels like we live in a pinball machine trying to optimize this entire situation with meeting the needs of the research community. We have lines of users out the door, which is what we had always wanted, but that does mean that some of you end up waiting longer than you wish, and we feel like we are not able to meet the needs of the community and continually strive to find new and creative ways to get things done. Of course, our biggest concern right now, which we hope will be solved in another week, is the crew time until the commercial crew flight stabilizes. The flights have, if we can get to 4 crew and keep them up there, it will be a whole lot better for all of us. And finally, we do not have unlimited resources to be as responsive as we'd like. We'd like to be able to meet, to do everything at as fast as everybody wants, but there are some issues where, or some times when we just can't do everything at once. If you've ever, packed for a move or something, you can't just pack everything in one day. It does take time, and we have that same problem with our cargo vehicles. So what's next? Many of you have heard about LEO commercialization and the plan that was rolled out a summer before last. That continues to move forward, but has had minimal effect on research at this point, and we will work to continue that. We continue to enable commercial research capabilities. There are now over 21 different commercial facilities on the ISS who are managed by commercial companies who are doing business and bringing in users and are available for us to use as NASA for our research needs. And then finally, there have been major changes in the approach to National Lab. You'll hear more about that in a National Lab session later. So I'll just say we in big picture talk about, initially the National Lab was to expand the user base. Now the focus is on strategic areas with a goal towards long-term creating sustained scalable demand for use of research in low Earth orbit that will support us in the long term for future commercial platforms. So final comment is just that this really is your space station. I hope we've finally gotten to the point where what we had envisioned at the beginning that Bill talked about of being there for research, that we are close to what we had hoped to get to. And our driving goal in our office is to enable your science in whatever way we can to do that. Thank you for your time. I'll hand it back over to Doug.
Well, thank you, Mary Beth. I just wanted to let our viewers know that we had a reboot of the system here, so that's what there was that brief pause. We're now moving from Mary Beth's talk on program management to Michael's talk on what is some experiences of an investigator. Michael? Certainly. Yeah, we're having some problems with the audio from Michael's system, so we'll be cutting over to him as soon as we can, if we can get those technical glitches worked out.
Yeah, now I can. All the buttons was on. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to talk today. But I have to admit, when I first got the invite, um, I wasn't sure. I mean, are you really sure you want me to give a talk? I'm not exactly all sunshine and rainbows. There's got to be a better person out there. But they said my experience with the ISS and my experience as an advocate for our students is exactly what they wanted. So here I am. This slide here in front of you is from the mission that we did back in a couple of years ago. I was a participant in the Hera mission. It's not really related to my talk. I just wanted to show that I've been invested in spaceflight science for a long time on both sides of the spectrum, both as a scientist and as a participant in the research. There we go. As some of you know, I've been doing this for a while. I started off as an undergrad in biosphere space technologies at University of Colorado in Boulder and didn't leave it until I got my PhD. This is from back in 1996, back in the shuttle days. I'm the guy way in the back at the top with the bad attitude. I think I was getting my master's at this point. You may recognize a few other people in this picture, and I'll get back to them later. While at Bioserve, I was able to participate in all sorts of studies ranging from plant and bacterial growth studies to immune responses in mice. And while it was extremely difficult at times, I look back on it now as an amazing experience and that I was lucky to have. But even after I left Bioserve, I continued to be involved with spaceflight experiments at Loma Linda University. For example, I was involved with 3 shuttle flights involving mice, STS-108, 118, and the last shuttle flight, 135. I met some cool people, did some cool science, published a few papers. But I was never a PI for any of these flights. I didn't have any control. And all these flights were sponsored by Amgen and run by Bioserve. I was just lucky to get some tissue from each of these flights to do some immune work. So you can imagine my excitement when I finally got my own flight grant funded, along with Keith Chapes. This was back in 2013. This is actually our second try for this study. Our first experimental design, it actually involved giving astronauts anthrax. And for some reason, the reviewers didn't like that idea. Not really sure why. But for this version, we just said we would do it in mice. And we would use something that all astronauts had already been vaccinated against, the tetanus toxoid. It's part of the Tdap series that we all get as kids, and we get boosters every 10 years or so. There was no danger to the astronauts, and it was a well-known immune challenge. We asked for, and surprisingly, we got 3 flights. We needed 3 flights because we were looking at both the primary and secondary immune responses. In experiment 1, we were going to fly the animals and inoculate in space. In 2, we were going to do 1 injection on the ground to establish immune memory, and then the second injection in flight to see if they were able to respond to that primary memory response. And then in the 3rd and final experiment, we were going to do both the primary and secondary injections in space to see if spaceflight impacted the development of memory. We were manifested on 2 back-to-back rodent research. Rodent Research 2 and Rodent Research 3, back in the SpaceX 6 and 7 days. Which goes to show you how important NASA thought this work was. We were supposed to be the first non-NASA animal studies to fly to station. Altogether, these experiments should tell us if the immune system can respond to a novel immune challenge in space, and if spaceflight impacts immune memory. This up here on the upper right was our mission patch. TARBIS stands for Tetanus Antibody Response B Cells in Space. It was originally called TARDIS, for those of you who are Doctor Who fans, for obvious reasons. It was actually on the paperwork for a while, but eventually the lawyers got a hold of it, and you can see what happened. Once we started getting organized, things immediately started going wrong. First off, the day after we made reservations for our kickoff meeting up at Ames, the entire US government shut down and most of Ames was furloughed, so we had to cancel our reservations. Then a few months later, Russia decided to go into Crimea. This made us worry because, of course, our astronauts use Russian facilities to actually get to the station. Then, of course, after all that, we got our very first reminder from NASA for progress report. Yeah, we haven't done anything yet. Then, as if that wasn't enough, everything else started going completely off the rails. The orbital Antares rocket exploded on the launch pad. That caused a shift in priorities in NASA, and our mission was bumped off of SpaceX 6 to make room for other, more mission-critical payloads. That launch went off okay, but then Progress failed to reach ISS and fell out of the sky. Then there was even more changes in priority, and we were also bumped off of SpaceX 7. Then, as most of you know, SpaceX 7 also failed shortly after liftoff. Please note the dates in bold on the right. For each of those launch attempts, we had already made reservations and were planning to going to Florida. We basically had to cancel our flights twice in a row, 5 weeks from launch. I think some of our supplies were actually on one of these rockets as well. I can't remember which. After that, as you can imagine, NASA stopped talking to us about flights. The entire flight experimental timeline was completely screwed up. And like some of you, we shifted gears towards ground-based studies for the next 2.5 years. We basically ran parts of our flight experiments on the ground doing radiation and Heinlein unloading studies. We were also looking around for someone else to help sponsor us. We looked at CASIS, HRP, NASA, NIH, or anyone that might be interested in space flight, both for flight and additional funding, since much of our funding had been shifted to our ground-based studies. Unfortunately, while there was some interest, nothing panned out. Everyone else had their own problems. But shortly after New Year's in 2018, about 5 years after we were originally funded, I got a phone call from Kevin Sato saying that we may have a chance for a flight. We were cautiously excited. Then a couple of months later, we heard that a letter went up the chain of command all the way up to Craig Kundrat's office from the HRP and in support of our experiment. The next thing we know, we're combining 2 of our flights into 1 flight, and that was supposed to happen at the end of March. Things got very, very busy very, very fast. In my lab, we have something called the Picot effect. It's like Murphy's Law on steroids, and you kind of saw some of that earlier today when we just had our glitch in our presentation. Things get weird when I'm involved. People don't believe me it's a thing when we first meet, but it doesn't take long to convince them. Trust me, it's a thing. Even Sung Shin at Ames is now a believer. Here are just a few of the things that happened during our experiments. First off, we were the first animal payload that was primarily run by Leidos. There was some learning curves associated with that on both sides. We are also launching out of Wallops. But remember, one of our 2 experiments included pre-flight injections, and all of that was happening in Florida. So launching out of Virginia complicated matters. We also had some issues with the efficacy of our drug. Remember, the original work for this study was done 3 or 4 years prior to this launch. That meant we had changes in lots in many of our supplies, so we had to quickly rerun some of our dose response studies, and that resulted in a lot of timeline-related anxiety for pretty much everyone, NASA and Leidos and us, everybody. We also had a control mouse die in one of the weighing procedures. We were one of the first payloads to use the MMB, the mass measuring device. And of course, during this process, we found out about the AEM lighting issues. For those of you who don't know, some of the lights were different in some of the AEMs due to changes at the company who made the lights. And unfortunately, because we were so close to launch, we couldn't change the configurations around to minimize the impact of the differences in lighting on our experiments. Believe it or not, when I was talking about this with my postdoc, she pointed out that I forgot several things. And I said, yeah, sure, but I only have 15 minutes, not 3 hours. But eventually I sent my team to Virginia. My tech, Nina Nishiyama, and my postdoc, Tricia Rettig, did the pre-flight science briefing while I stayed at KSC preparing for various scrub scenarios. Then we finally launched. Nothing blew up or fell out of the sky this time, and things went relatively well once the mice were up there. We got our primary samples back in August of last year, and once we finished another experiment that was going on at the same time, we started processing samples. In March, the biospecimen sharing program from Ames flew down to Loma Linda to work with our in-house team. We were supposed to be collecting all of the tissues that the astronauts didn't get in orbit. Altogether, we had about 20 to 25 people involved. And then, of course, the Picot effect happened again. Literally the exact day that the VSP team flew down to Loma Linda, Ames announced that someone tested positive in COVID. So everyone freaked out. Loma Linda is a teaching hospital, so you can imagine why. The powers that be basically said the risks were unacceptable and shut the whole project down. Everybody had to go home. So why am I telling you all this? Why am I giving all the sordid details? Because I want to make a point about the students working on these kinds of projects. Yes, the ISS is an amazing platform. Yes, it's exciting, and sharing the experience is a wonderful thing. And I'm extremely thankful for all the previous people that were speaking today, because of all the work that they did allowed me to do the experiments that we do. And yes, it's very important. This is just one endpoint, but it's probably the most important finding of any of the work I've done with NASA. It's an ELISA measuring antibody concentrations in the blood after vaccination. Specifically, we are looking at IgG, IgA, and IgM concentrations. The first graph on the left is for the primary vaccination in space. Just focus on the gray bars. We can talk about the details later if you'd like. The first on the left is the ground controls, and the second one is the flight. As you can see, there's a huge decrease in the antibody response in flight. Yes, it's significant. We just didn't put the bars in there because this is preliminary data. The second graph is for the second experiment that we were running at the same time, which we vaccinated the mice on the ground, flew them in space, and gave them a second inoculation in orbit. This was supposed to tell us if immune memory developed on the ground was still effective in space. Notice that once again, the antibody response is a lot smaller in space. Bottom line, the ability to respond to an immune challenge is diminished even if you've been vaccinated on the ground before flight. And I believe if we ever get to fly our third experiment, this memory response is going to be even further reduced if both the primary and secondary injections occur in orbit. So despite all this cool and wonderful stuff, the uncertainty is absolutely terrifying to our students. We have enough uncertainty in our daily lives. Look at the last few days with the election. It's still not over. Throw on top of that the lack of consistent funding and the lack of flight and ground opportunities for students once they do commit. It's a wonder any students stay involved. I admit, what we do is hard. Animal work is extremely hard. And like the title of my talk, it takes a special kind of crazy to do what we do. But if we want to keep students engaged and involved, we have to show them that we have their backs, that we can support them even when things go wrong. And that means consistent and stable funding. Case in point, most of the students involved with this TARBIS project that I just described have since moved on. Most are not doing spaceflight work because they saw what we went through. Even though they all felt it was a great experience that they'll remember for the rest of their lives, almost all of them have decided it's too much stress to deal with long term, so they look elsewhere for their careers. I'm showing you this slide again because I want to point out a few things. All of the people I have circled here are heavily involved with spaceflight biology work. This is Louis Stodiak here. This is Paul Todd. This is Dave Klaus. This back here is Ted Bateman. And Ted Bateman was able to actually grow the interest in spaceflight experience with his students. I think Jeff Willey is probably attending this conference as well. So he was able to, even when he left CU, he was able to expand that interest beyond what was going on in Colorado. But as hard as it was to work there sometimes, BioServe got things done, and they trained a lot of people. And they could do this not only because they had a passion for the work, but they also had relatively stable funding and multiple flight opportunities. This allowed students to stay engaged and enthusiastic throughout getting their degrees. I should also point out that even though Keith Chapes is not in this picture, he was part of BioServe at the time at the K-State branch of BioServe. Luckily, as you heard earlier, our opportunities for getting to the station are improving. We're going through sort of a renaissance. This is SpaceX down here, and this is NG-11. This is our actual launch for our TARBIS experiment. And things are only getting better. We're going farther and farther away, asking harder questions, doing greater things. But to do it, we need to have the trust of our students so they can carry on the work after we're done. Maybe we should be thinking along the lines of the Starfleet Academy. And I think that's the end of my time, so thank you, and I'll hand it back over.
Fantastic. That was fascinating, Michael. I'm going to be sure to look through the literature and find out whether your bad luck continues. That's a an interesting string you had, and I'm really glad that you keep a positive attitude. And I know that your students have had a great experience working with you from just listening to how you interact with us. So I'd like to go now into the open session with all of the members of our panel here. I wonder if we could get some reaction to what Michael has said from one of our administrative members here, either Julie or Mary Beth. Do you have some comments in terms of the, I mean, it is difficult to run space experiments. I have had experiences myself, and I remember that on my specific first experiment on the shuttles, we lost our video cameras, and the astronauts had to go in there and rip apart the back of our panel to get things working again. And in fact, they saved my science. And so hearing about these difficulties, do you have any comments over the years as to your experiences?
Sure. So it absolutely is hard to do science in space. You know, you don't have your grad students, you don't have yourself, you can't just go tweak things yourself. And because of, you know, the variety of issues over the years, a process has grown up around everything, right? You want to send the crew a note, there's a process. You want to do this, there's a process. You want to, you know, change things on the fly, there's a process. And so it's from a researcher's perspective, it's got to be exhausting and just frustrating. And you know, without people who are there and dedicated to try and walk you through it step by step, and really understand that this is the point of the platform, is to do this work, is to do the research and see what we learn. It can be just exhausting. We are trying to, you know, train the crew in basic life sciences skills. We've got, you know, some other training classes where it's just, you know, you haven't been in a chemistry lab since high school or college. Let's go back through, you know, how to pipette, how to do, you know, basic wet lab techniques, and same thing with rodents and a number of other areas. Where we struggle is there's so many uses for space station and so many competing priorities, that it's very hard to continue to build towards, you know, a user-friendly platform that looks just like your lab and meet the needs for the exploration of, well, let's put in a comm delay, and let's, you know, let's try some of the things that Julie mentioned that we absolutely need to do for exploration. We need to learn how to do that too. But we can't do that and at the same time have, you know, 6 people talking on space to ground running their experiments. And so it's the struggle, I think, with the platform is really summed up into there are so many competing uses and priorities that are counter to each other, that it's very hard to try and have a process that's one size fits all, or that you're right, everything has to be adjusted for each individual payload. You know, Julie commented that they always ask her what her favorite experiment is, and she, you know, you just can't pick because they're all your children. And within our office, we understand that this is for each individual PI and payload developer, right? This is their livelihood. This is their lifeblood. And this is the most important thing they're doing. And there's about 300 of you at a time, right? So it's trying to maintain, you know, a helpful, positive attitude and find a way to meet the needs of all 300 of you, to the best of our ability. And sometimes that means not everybody gets everything they want, but we really do try and facilitate that to the best of our ability, given the constraints we have, you know, with capabilities, with budget, with all those things.
Thank you. I also have found that it's always amazed me that you can work 300 experiments at once. It's just the logistics involved with fitting in the various needs. Some facilities will need excess power at the same time as another facility, and just getting that all intermeshed is such an amazing process. What I'd like to do is ask Julie about the future, though. Here several months ago, I guess we were, as a scientific community, we were thinking that, okay, what are we going to do with ISS, as it becomes an aging facility, and the plans were not very well directed for us to have other platforms other than LEO short missions. There weren't really many opportunities for any of these long-term experiments, but in recent months, that view from NASA seems to have changed. We've had people coming to ask us, well, how can we do things on the moon? And this looking forward, what challenges do you see in terms of getting an integrated program from the fact that we have a whole new now suite of opportunities available to us?
Yeah, it is an amazing time with the different possibilities for human spaceflight that are out there. And one thing I think that's especially important is the fact that this is not an either or. So from a NASA strategic perspective, we see a continuing long-term need for low Earth orbit, and to evolve that from ISS, and it's going to be ISS for a while, but there's got to be a human presence in low Earth orbit forever for the United States, which means there should be opportunities for research in low Earth orbit when that's the appropriate platform over the long term. At the same time as lunar surface research opportunities are opening up, I think we always have to temper that enthusiasm with realism about two things. One is we tried to build space station as a multi-purpose laboratory to meet everybody's needs with massive amounts of transportation and access, and it is really, really hard to get science done. It takes lots of people, takes lots of patience, and those challenges are only harder when you go to cislunar space, when you go to the lunar surface. And we'll be resetting in terms of doing these first missions with very limited infrastructure. So they're going to be more like Expedition 1, Expedition 2, when I can remember in Expedition 4 working really hard to get 1 hour of crew time to swab some surfaces for a microbial study. So we are going to be back to that kind of difficulty on these early missions, where making sure that we don't lose the crew is going to dominate our efforts, and then other things are going to be extra. Now, we are absolutely committed to doing science from the very first landing mission, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen quickly. The second limitation is always in the funding, and so that kind of connects to what Michael was talking about. Spaceflight is hard. We're always challenged to do spaceflight missions really on a shoestring budget for NASA and on shoestring budgets for the research. So our researchers are struggling. They don't have continuation funding to keep graduate students going when things are postponed. They wind up waiting in queues to execute research. All of those things are enhanced or exacerbated, made worse by the challenges with the budget for research funding. I don't see that changing over time. It means that the thing I would say as a scientist that we have to be really careful about, a lot of times when we sense that zero-sum game, for some reason as scientists, we come together and start taking pot shots at each other. The life scientists start saying, hey, that earth science is not worth doing. You could have done that on a satellite or something like that, rather than kind of grapple with the core challenges of that spaceflight is hard and expensive and risky. And then the additional funding you need to do good science on it is also tentative and challenging every step of the way. If we recognize that's a shared community concern and challenge, rather than fight amongst ourselves for those limited resources, I think we can do a lot better as an integrated community, rather than just trying to advocate for our own piece of that pie.
All right. Well, thank you very much. There's several questions in the queue. I'm going to have to apologize, but we're not going to be able to get to them in the interest of time. With luck, some people can review that chat and get back to our the people asking those questions. So with that, I'd like to close this this panel and thank our speakers today for such a fantastic insight into many of the different ways of looking at how over the years we as a community have been able to utilize this fantastic facility, the ISS. So thank you, Bill, Julie, Mary Beth, and Michael. From all of us, this was a wonderful discussion. Moving forward from that, I'm going to be closing for a break now, a very short break actually. We will be breaking into the physical sciences plenary, and we'll be breaking over into the biological sciences program as well. As usual, the biologists have come up with a fantastic name for their seminar, their panels. And in this case, the title is Stress, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So, I hope you enjoy the upcoming seminars and have a good break.